Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
He's in the building!
Drink the moment. Drink it.
I said, empty your mind.
Coquettish and coy. Ow. Ow.
What?
And there's people that are dying.
The wickedly talented.
More than great. It was historic.
Crack is
World.
Oh, good for you.
I have to apologize.
One of the hottest.
Hello, and welcome back to The Reheat, a podcast that re-examines the spiciest celebrity news and scandals of yesteryear and asks, how would we react to the same events if they'd transpired today? I'm Sarah Sahagian, and today, Sadaf is on a well-deserved trip to London, England. So we are joined instead by writer, historian, and podcaster, Dr. Joanne Paul. Known for her successful and scintillating books about Tudor England, Joanne is here to speak to us about what I think of as my own personal Roman Empire, the life and death of Anne Boleyn, the English queen who inspired Henry VIII to create an entirely new religion so he could get a divorce and marry her before ultimately executing his new bride a few years later. Yes, historical gossip is the best gossip, but before we get into the specifics of this salacious story, welcome, Joanne. Tell us a bit about yourself. How did you become fascinated with Tudor England? Because I know this is your expertise as an historian.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's brilliant to join you. Well, that's a difficult question. How does it all begin? I think, like many who are fascinated with this period, it probably actually began with fiction, with fictional portrayals. They are a sort of gateway to wanting to find out more. I don't tend to usually object too much to dramatic portrayals of Tudor England, because then people start asking me questions. People read books. They read my books sometimes. And I think that's how I got into it as well. I think the Tudor period is a really interesting mix of the fantastical, the medieval, the very unfamiliar, and something that is a bit more familiar, that feels very modern. And I think it is that combination that makes it so intriguing to us. Plus, of course, all the scandal and drama, some of which I think we're going to talk about today.
Absolutely. I mean, this is just a mind-blowing time. If you were alive at this time, I can't imagine how you would have responded to all of this news.
Well, and it's a period where it's starting to become more widespread that you're actually hearing about this stuff. You know, we're talking about a time just after the invention of the printing press. You know, it's only come to London a few decades before all of this is happening. So news is spreading in ways that it hadn't before. It's analogous to the internet, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first information revolution, I guess you're getting gossip in a way that you weren't before, which you used to get local gossip, and now you're getting gossip about the king and his wife, and so that must have been really entertaining for people. So we're talking about the Tudor era today. Thank you so much for that. So for many, I would say specifically for like a certain segment of white girls who grew up reading a lot of historical fiction, so people like me, this really is a Roman Empire. Some might blame Philippa Gregory and the other Boleyn girl, which I know you will probably, as a historian, take issue with that book. And I've read a lot of historical critiques of that book too. But it did introduce a lot of people to Anne Boleyn and to her sister Mary Boleyn. So it did that public service. And the truth is, popular culture has actually been fixated on this family for some time, even before millennials discovered it with the other Boleyn girl. So I think back to the 1969 British epic film Anne of the Thousand Days, or more recently, actually, the Wolf Hall books and television series. The truth is, just many of us have been obsessed with this story for a long time, and it seems like will be forever. This story doesn't die. It is evergreen. So let's start at the beginning of this icon's life. Born at the start of the 1500s, who was Anne Boleyn, Joanne?
We actually know a fair bit about her early life. She seems to have been very well educated. Her father was a courtier and a diplomat and wanted to make sure she had a very European education. So she spends time on the continent in the courts of European rulers and women in particular who themselves were very educated, very cultured. And so she's introduced to things that are actually much more cultured than what's going on in England at the time. And so when she comes back, she brings all of this with her. That's why in something like Wolf Hall, Claire Foy affects this sort of French accents every once in a while to give this sense of kind of pretension. But probably she knew a lot more than a lot of the women around her in England. She is coming, though, from a family that doesn't have a long claim to nobility. The Boleyns are upstarts in many ways, although her mother's family, the Howards, do have this sort of blue blood in them. They are nobility from way back, or at least they like to pretend to be. There's all sorts of treason and beheadings and things, but they like to pretend that they are in any case. And so although she's a Boleyn, she's in many ways a Howard as well. And so carries both that sort of nouveau riche and old guard lineage within her.
And that's fascinating. And I think that a lot of people have made comparisons between the Boleyns and the Middletons, which I frankly don't really get. I don't think anyone is as scheming as people were in the Tudor era. I think that if you put the Boleyns in the Tudor era, they would not have been able to secure the throne for one of their children. I really don't think so. But I mean, what do you think of that modern comparison? I'm just curious.
I've never heard that one. That's
really?
That's new to me. Yeah, no. And I mean, I probably know far more. Well, I do know far more about the Boleyns than the Middletons. But I have seen The Crown. And it does look like there was some scheming and positioning that happened there. I mean, what's interesting with the Boleyns is it's difficult to say how intentional it was that they are sort of thrusting their daughters at the king. But what they're doing is taking advantage of when his eye does fall on a Boleyn. There's sort of two different approaches they take with two different daughters. For readers of the other Boleyn girl, they of course know that Anne's sister, Mary, was a mistress of Henry VIII and probably for about 3 to 5 years, depending which account you read. And it's suggested that she may have borne him some children as well. But she becomes his mistress, and she's not his first mistress, she's not his last mistress, but it does give her great advantage. Her husband, she's married at the time, receives all sorts of grants and rewards for the fact that his wife is sleeping with the king. And so they do very well off the back of it. But that, of course, is not the approach that Anne takes. It's usually suggested sort of holds out for a bigger prize. The other way of looking at that is that she just isn't interested in Henry VIII, that she doesn't want what her sister has chosen, and maybe just doesn't want him, maybe just doesn't want to be involved with him. But of course, once he proposes, there's not much she can really do at that point. You don't say no to the king. But that, of course, brings all sorts of advantages as well. So it's hard to say how much is intentional, how much is planned, but certainly they, for at least a while, they benefit from it.
That's interesting because you were saying we don't really know whether she was scheming or just wasn't interested. She's often portrayed as just intentionally playing hard to get, as just the ultimate strategist. If she were a contemporary person, she would have written a dating advice for women, probably, right? She would have been some sort of dating guru with a podcast. So I'm just curious, why do you think people portray her that way so consistently? It's almost like we are certain that that's who she was, but what you're saying is the historical record does not bear that out. We don't know.
Yeah, she's often portrayed, I think, as this ultimate gold digger, right? And as withholding sex, right? Very specifically withholding sex in order to almost up the bidding on her to, okay, well, now you can be queen. There is no evidence for that. In terms of the letters that we have between them when they're, we'll call it courting, we only have his letters. Hers were destroyed. So we only have half of that conversation. He does appear to be begging for something. He is sexualizing her in all sorts of ways. One of my favorite pieces of vocabulary from the Tudor period comes from those letters where he talks about her duckies, which are her breasts. And he's imagining her duckies. So it is very sexual. But she, best we can tell from those letters, she is saying no in some sense. She is keeping him at bay. And for centuries, historians, largely male, have read that as her dangling something, as her stringing him along. But in more recent decades, especially as more women are reading this, going, that's not the only reading here. She just might not be interested. And in some ways, that's why I love, you mentioned Anne of 1,000 Days. In that portrayal, she's not stringing him along. She hates him.
Yeah, she doesn't like him at all.
Exactly. And I think Geneviève Bujold is so fantastic in that film. I think it captures something of the spirit of Anne. And I think that that's a fair reading. She just might not want him at all.
Yeah, exactly. It's just so interesting that, as you said, the male historians kind of project their misogynistic feelings about women onto this person who we don't know a lot about because, as you said, her correspondence was destroyed. We know very little about the way she thought, her approach to anything in this world. And so it reminds me of this fact that psychologists have found that women usually, when they're dealing with men always overestimate their sexual interest in them. And so I'm thinking that the historians are projecting experiences they've had with women who weren't interested onto this relationship and are thinking, oh, that woman liked me. She was just playing hard to get. Therefore, Anne Boleyn is playing hard to get when, of course, she might not have liked him. Or maybe even if she did like him, she didn't want to destroy a country and become the most hated woman in England. I don't know. He seemed pretty erratic.
Yeah, there's so much at stake in a decision like that. And she's seen her sister's experience. I don't think her sister's experience was quite as tragic as the other Boleyn girl presents it, but it might not have been what she wanted for herself. She was probably smart enough to be ambitious and wanted a good marriage and thought that this could jeopardize that, perhaps. She also seems to have been very religious. Of course, everyone's religious in the 16th century, but she seems to have taken that very seriously. We know from the way that she controls her ladies when she is queen that she takes that very seriously. And so may have indeed truly wanted to stay chaste and was saying no to him. I love this insight from psychology that, yeah, it has to do with this assumption that every woman really wants to say yes, even if she's saying no. And that was definitely considered to be truth in the 16th century, that women were simply playing hard to get if they said no.
And that's one of the reasons why I love studying history, because it shows you that all of these narratives, all these patriarchal narratives are so old, right? They existed then, they exist now. We actually have so much in common with people from this period. The misogyny was rampant. There was a lack of consent culture, right? I mean, you're the king, and so you are just doggedly pursuing this woman that, at least it doesn't seem like, wants you. Even if she is playing hard to get, what she's doing makes it seem like she doesn't want you and maybe you should back off. Anyway, it's fascinating. That's the thing that's most interesting about history to me.
Yeah, and I'll just say, we're talking about a very long period of time that this, and again, I'll call it courtship, is taking place. They meet somewhere in the early 1520s, probably around 1525, 1526, this exchange of letters starts to take place. We're not talking about them actually being physically involved in getting married until 1533. That's a long time for this pursuit to be happening. And it's a long time for Anne to be saying no over and over and over again. So either, yes, the Victorian men writing these histories were right, and she's dangling the ultimate prize and toying with him and teasing him and whatever, or she just really means it and she means it over a period of nearly a decade.
Yeah, and it's also interesting the way people oversimplify Henry VIII's motivations here too. And I don't like Henry VIII. I'm not a fan of his.
You don't? Really?
One of the worst,
shocking,
most violent husbands in the history of the world, right? Like, awful. It's domestic violence on just a national scale. It's horrific. But I also think, just from what I know about him, and obviously you know much more, it seems like, yes, he did definitely want to sleep with Anne Boleyn. That was the girl he liked. But also, he just wanted to replace his wife because he was obsessed with having a son. So if it hadn't been Anne, it likely would have been someone else he pursued.
Yeah, and obviously, as we know, and you have already given this away, so I don't feel bad saying it. It doesn't last long. Once he does sleep with her, he moves on pretty quickly. After that, he probably has at least one mistress when they are married, and then, of course, picks up with someone at the end of their marriage and marries her very quickly after Anne's execution. So it doesn't have much staying power afterwards. It absolutely is to do with the fact that he wants a son. He feels that he needs a son. There are reasons for that in the 16th century. There hasn't been a queen regnant, a woman ruling in her own right, either for a very long time or at all, depending on how you feel about the Empress Matilda. But in any case, it's not a good example. It makes sense in the 16th century that you don't want a woman on the throne, because not only is she considered too emotional and lacking reason and what have you, but she's got to get married, and a husband rules his wife. And so whoever she marries ends up ruling the country. And that's just too much of a wild card in the 16th century. That's terrifying. And so a son is really very necessary. And absolutely, by the time you hit the 1520s, Catherine of Aragon, his wife, who he marries when he comes to the throne, had one living daughter, Mary, but unfortunately they've had a series of stillbirths and miscarriages, and it doesn't look like there's going to be any other pregnancies and any other children. And so he needs another route to a son. That in itself should not be a big deal. That has happened in other royal marriages. The marriage is annulled, the king remarries, and one hopes that they're able to produce male heirs. But it's the wider geopolitical context for this that makes it more complicated for him to do what is really just a sort of simple swap in most cases.
Is that because Spain was just so powerful at the time?
Pretty much, yeah. It has a lot to do with the fact Catherine of Aragon is Spanish. She's the aunt of the most powerful ruler in Europe at the time, Charles V, who's not only King of Spain, but he has a bunch of titles in Burgundy and the Netherlands and everything else, and he's the Holy Roman Emperor. So he has control of vast resources and a lot of Europe. And just before this all kicks off, he also takes the Pope prisoner. And it's really all up to the Pope whether he's going to grant this annulment or not. And he's not really interested in peeving off Charles V at this point. And so it's not something that is immediately accessible to Henry. Catherine is just too powerful a queen to be discarded.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that a lot of our listeners would probably think that there are parallels to the machinations that go on in things like, I don't know, Real Housewives or Vanderpump, obviously at a less grand scale. But these narratives, right, of, alliances and all of these strategies have been going on for centuries, right? And it's funny because it comes down to a human thing, whereas this vain king really feels like he needs a son because he's sexist, right? His motivations they're small and they're misogynistic, but they're very human. And it's just kind of funny that all of these countries are doing these things because this one guy has an ego.
And I think that's part of what always makes this story so compelling and why it's dramatized again and again and again, is because at the end of the day, you have relatable characters. Even in the 16th century, people were relating to Catherine as sort of the discarded wife and a husband who was looking at someone younger and arguably hotter and, maybe had picked up a few tricks on the continent and what have you, right? And this idea of the other woman and breaking up a marriage and all of this stuff. There's something so relatable about all of that. But it is taking place in this much larger context and has these huge ramifications and consequences that shape the world we live in today.
Absolutely. But I mean, it's funny because this creates a narrative that I think we still, whether the writers of the Hollywood gossip knows or not, are imposing on stories today. I think about the narrative of Angelina Jolie stealing Brad Pitt from Jennifer Aniston. And the whole narrative was, oh, Jennifer Aniston couldn't have children. He wanted to have children with this slightly younger, even more conventionally attractive, because obviously Jennifer Aniston's very beautiful, even more conventionally attractive woman.
Yeah, I think that's a really good analogy, and of course we are waking up to the fact now that he's just a loser.
Yes, exactly.
That he's just a horrible
Exactly.
person.
And did abuse his second wife too, right?
Yeah,
And that's the other
yeah,
interesting
exactly.
parallel. Once he had her and had children with her, I mean, the FBI has a file on that man because he abused his wife on a plane, right? So it is fascinating. And I mean, it doesn't take a genius to find the similarities. And so we see that patriarchy and the logic of patriarchy is alive and well. It's basically the same logic as we had in the 1500s.
Pretty much.
So on that note, I think it's time for a short break, and then we will come back and we'll talk about how Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn actually did get together and what the world thought about it. Okay, we are back. So let's dive right back into the conversation. So tell me, Joanne, how did the average person in the UK see Anne Boleyn? Did they know about her before Henry finally pulled the plug on his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, got divorced, and created a new religion to marry this woman? I mean, I'm just wondering when people knew about the story and how much they knew. If you're just the average person in London going to your work, I don't know what you do. Maybe you own a tavern. You're eating onions for supper. I believe that's what they often ate for supper at this period. When do you
Just
find
chew
out
it
about
on an
this?
onion. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's difficult for us to know. And I know that's the annoying historian's answer. It's difficult for us to know. But of course, we don't have many records of the average person living in England in the early 16th century. We mostly rely on other people reporting to us what people are saying, and they have their own agendas. So most of our sources that we're looking at for this sort of thing are things like ambassadors' reports, maybe some chronicles, and they are usually trying to make an argument one way or the other. So ambassadors are often playing up the idea that she's deeply unpopular because they hate her. And chronicles, well, it depends on when they're written, will either say that, yes, actually, she was very popular and people were very happy to welcome her. For instance, if they're writing when her daughter's on the throne much, much later. So we have this difficulty to try to figure that out. Certainly, your average innkeeper, say in London at the time, running a tavern, as you say, would probably have been aware of Anne Boleyn as we head into the late 1520s and into the 1530s. There are probably going to be rumors about what's happening. They would certainly have been aware, for instance, when Catherine is no longer attending progresses, because once a year, typically, Henry is going around his realm sort of waving at people and forcing people to host him in their homes, costing them a great deal of money. And Catherine is not attending a lot of these progresses as you head into the 1530s. She might show up for a little bit, but generally they're not seeing each other. And actually Anne is coming with him. And so this replacement people are aware of. And further around the country than in London, because they're sort of touring, king on tour. People would have been talking about this, would have been gossiping. For the most part, I think it's fair to say that Catherine was very popular. People had a lot of loyalty to Catherine. She'd been married to Henry since he came to the throne, essentially. And before that, she'd been married to his older brother. So she'd been around and sort of on the scene and in position to be Queen of England for a very long time, longer than he'd been in position to be King of England. And people were very loyal to her, not only as this idea of sort of as the older woman being displaced, but I think in many ways, I mean, we've been drawing all sorts of analogies. She was the people's princess in this scenario. She was the wife. She had won the hearts of the people. She was known for her charity. She had, seen the people had seen her. Anne Boleyn was Camilla. She was the one people didn't really know much about, but she seems to be inserting herself in this otherwise perfect idea of a marriage. She's the problem. I think a lot of people saw it that way in the 16th century, although we just can't know how much that permeated.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I think that for me, as somebody who studies a lot of sort of contemporary scandals, it's really tempting for me to just impose that narrative on the past and say, exactly, it was exactly like Charles and Camilla and Diana. I'm just wondering, as a historian, what do you think when people try to, I know we just made the comparison and there are definitely similarities, but what do you think when we try to, like, modern people like me, try to force these narratives into the exact same cookie cutter template?
I think an analogy can be really helpful. I just use that one because I think sometimes we don't see Catherine in that light. We see her just as this sort of older woman who, I don't know, almost seems like she deserves to be discarded. Well, of course he didn't want to stay with his wife. She was so much older, and she's often presented as sort of much, much older than him and a bit shriveled or what have you, like it's of course, right? And so I think making a comparison like that draws us into thinking, oh, wait, that's not how they saw it in the 16th century. So I think that can be really useful. We look at Six the Musical, for instance. Obviously, they're not in Tudor costume. They're not using Tudor words. They're using very modern words and modern comparisons to help us understand the 16th century. I think that can be really useful to us as a way in. Of course, then I have the opportunity to go, but actually, and fill in the detail of that. But as a teacher, as a public historian, I think it can be useful as a sort of enlightening to get us to think a different way about the past than the way that we have traditionally done so, often again through these old tropes and narratives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I love anachronisms and I love analogy. So I'm glad to hear that it's okay, that I'm not being overly indulgent by doing this all the time. So let's talk about the actual divorce from Catherine. So when it actually happens, and there's an entirely new religion created just so we can marry Anne Boleyn. So this is a seismic event in British history. And I mean, I think this is part of Anne Boleyn's lore, right? Where people see her as so sexy that a man created a new religion for her. So powerful in withholding sex that he would do anything, literally disavow the Pope. So let's talk about that.
Well, the first thing I'll say is just around vocabulary, because I've been using divorce and annulment interchangeably. You just used the word divorce. That's how they used it in the 16th century. Was these are interchangeable terms, annulment and divorce. So it was referred to as a divorce, but in our modern terms, we would call it an annulment. And I think that's very important because it's not an acknowledgement that the marriage happened and then they decided to end it. What he was seeking and what it is that he sort of secured for himself was that the marriage had never taken place. They had never been legally married. And so the child resulting from that union, Mary, is not legitimate. She's a bastard, right? Because they weren't married when they had her. And that obviously, it's a slightly different thing than a divorce to say that all of that time, they were not married. All of that time, she was not legitimately Queen of England. All of that time that she called herself wife, him husband, that was not allowable. That was not legal. That was not right in God's eyes. That's a very different thing to agree to than, oh, I'm sorry, we're not getting on. Let's have a divorce. She resists it. So you've got Catherine's resistance. You've got this whole geopolitical problem happening whereby they can't go the usual route via the Pope. And around all of that as well, you've got the Reformation, so this splintering of the Catholic Church. And so at some point, it occurs to Henry, or it is presented to Henry, more likely, that he could just skip that Pope part. That if he made himself head of the English Church, he could decide on his own marriage. He could decide whether it had ever been legitimate. And the reason for its illegitimacy, they used the fact that she'd been married to his older brother. And so he wasn't allowed to marry her. And the Pope had initially allowed that to happen. Well, they're saying the Pope doesn't know what he's talking about. right? And Henry's going to make that decision. And so, in order to secure all of that, he has to make himself head of the English church, which he does through parliaments, and then sets someone up as Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. He makes the decision, essentially, that the marriage has never been legitimate. That's all passed through Parliament. And Henry marries Anne before, by the way, all of this is passed through Parliament. Before all of this is decided, he jumps the gun very much. They sleep together and get married, probably in that order. But it's all sort of, in hindsight, legitimated by the fact that this marriage to Catherine had never existed. So you get people calling him a bigamist, who believe that marriage, that first marriage, was legitimate, and he's now married again. It's very unpopular in some circles.
Yeah, I see how that would be unpopular. So can you tell me which groups in particular were upset about this?
Yeah, in particular, sort of two groups that overlap. One certainly is anyone allied with Charles V, so the imperial court, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Spanish. They call her the concubine, the woman. They completely reject her as a legitimate wife, as a queen. They're particularly afraid for Mary, who's now been made illegitimate, right? They're worried about Catherine, who's been cast off. She's literally sent off away from the court. They're worried that either or both of them may be killed. They're worried that Anne might convince Henry to do that. So they're certainly opposed to anything to do with the marriage. The other group are much more, they're English, and they're much more concerned about the actual break with Rome. So they're concerned with the establishment of this, as we now know it, new religion. This idea that Henry, in order to secure this marriage and the succession, has broken apart the Catholic Church at a time of extreme vulnerability to the Catholic Church because of this larger Reformation that's happening largely in Europe. And so these are people like Thomas More, who is actually executed for his opposition to Henry as head of the English Church. He does, in fact, recognize the marriage because he thinks that, well, I guess Parliament has the right to decide who the Queen is going to be. But his problem is with how that comes about, which is this break with Rome.
Okay, fascinating.
Sorry, there's a lot there.
No, I know. There's a lot of opposition. And I get it. There's a lot of opposition. Do we have any insight into how the average British person responds to being told, okay, guys, we've got a new religion now, right? So the Pope's out. The king's the head of the church now. He's not just the head of your country. Oh, by the way, new wife, right? Just everything's different. Okay.
Yeah, there's certainly opposition sort of on the ground, I guess, as well. Some people just get on with it. They get on with their lives. Some people are, in fact, all for it. Lutheranism, what we now think of as Protestantism, has support in England, particularly because it actually reaches back to an older kind of what was known as heresy in England at the time. And so people had kind of clung to those beliefs. So for some, it's very welcome. Some of those people are in court at the time. People like Thomas Cromwell appear to have been of that sort of persuasion religiously. And there are many others across the country as well. But there is a lot of popular opposition, and particularly when Henry starts doing things like dissolving the monasteries as head of the church for various reasons, some of them financial, some of them vaguely theological. That creates a lot of opposition, and there is a popular sort of revolt or rebellion that takes place called the Pilgrimage of Grace, where people marching on London in opposition to all of these policies. It does create a huge problem for Henry.
Absolutely. And it makes sense. What happens to the people other than, I remember you mentioned Thomas More and he was executed, but is the average person who's marching to London, did they face consequences, or does the monarchy just sort of leave them be?
Well, the monarchy does not leave anyone be, really. One of the things that they do in order to secure the people's allegiance to the new succession, so to Anne and then to her daughter, Elizabeth, who is born very soon after their marriage in September 1533, is they pass an act declaring the succession, and with it an oath that everyone has to sort of sign up that Anne is queen, Elizabeth's the heir, and they're going to defend them. So people are forced to agree to all of this. And it contains the preamble about Henry being head of the church. So people have to sign up to all of this. And this is how they sort of expose people like Thomas More, who are probably going to stay pretty quiet about the whole thing, but they're forced in compliance through this oath. And so people like Thomas More, another one is John Fisher. There's a variety of Carthusian monks, for instance, and others who just refuse to take this oath, and they are executed for it. And then participants in the Pilgrimage of Grace, some manage to go back home and sort of leave independently, but there is also very much an attack on those who are seen to be rebelling against the king, and many, 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 many of them are killed.
So there's a lot of bloodshed. There's a lot of carnage. Okay. So this is kind of, it's almost giving, the legend of the Battle of Troy, right? Where a lot of stuff goes on. You can see why this is lore that people still are fascinated by. There's just so much goes wrong. So they have this new religion, and it's just fascinating to me that the religion actually survives Henry's death. And do you have any insight about why it does?
Well, what's fascinating is I was just talking about the Pilgrimage of Grace, and that takes place after Anne Boleyn's execution. We're already talking about the way in which this continues past the initial issue, which had brought it about. It's because I think there's such a grassroots interest in this kind of religion, in this, as we would now call it, Protestantism. It also has to do with some of his later wives, who are also of that religion, of that viewpoint, and particularly the way in which his eventual heir, Edward, is educated and his dedication to it, as well as Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, who of course becomes Elizabeth I, very important English monarch. The fact that she's educated in that as well. And Anne Boleyn then becomes presented as this sort of pioneer of Protestantism. And there's almost this sort of retconning of Henry and Anne's relationship as intentionally setting up this new religion that is free from Catholic idolatry and superstition and all of that sort of thing. That's not really how it plays out at the time, but everything is rewritten into this sort of narrative.
Yeah, this narrative. And I guess, if you're Elizabeth and you don't really know your mother, maybe you just want the narrative of her life to be a bit more meaningful. And so you're ascribing all of these ambitions to her.
Yeah, I think we do that now. I think there's still a desire. Anne was very intelligent. Was she an intellectual? Not sure. She was very religious. Could we call her a Protestant? Probably that's too much. But certainly there are suggestions that she's reading some of these writers at the time, these Protestant writers, as we'd now call them. She may have been introduced to some of these ideas when she was on the continent, for instance. There are lots of maybes and possiblies around it. So we can't say for sure. But this idea that, Henry and Anne were great liberators in establishing this church obviously is a step too far.
Also, the idea, I think in the Other Boleyn Girl, it's almost implied that she suggests Protestantism to Henry, that this is her idea, the Reformation.
Yeah, this comes from something that's written under Elizabeth. A historian, a chronicler called John Fox writes something now known as the Book of Martyrs. And in it, he suggests that she puts a very important text in Henry's hands that sets out that kings should essentially be completely sovereign in their own realms and not be subject to the Pope, which is essentially what Henry ends up doing. This is a very convenient thing to say under Elizabeth. It's part of that narrative. Whether she did that or not, it's very hard to say. More likely, the idea came from people like Thomas Cromwell or others in his court. I'd love to say that, yes, it all comes from Anne and her knowledge of these writers and these ideas, but we can't pin that down.
I would love to think of her as the first Protestant reformer, but I understand that we can't. That's how I want to think about her. Okay, so we're going to take a short break, and then we come back. We're going to talk about how the marriage between Anne and Henry ended. And spoiler alert, it's not good. Nothing good happens. And we are back. So let's dive right back into this conversation. All right, let's talk about it. How did Anne Boleyn meet her end? How did this marriage come apart? Let's talk about how it devolves and how it ends up being one of the worst marital disasters in the history of Britain.
In many ways, it falls apart in the same way that his first marriage has, just a little bit faster. Anne is crowned pregnant, very pregnant, gives birth in September of 1533 to a girl. Now, the expectation, the promise around that pregnancy was that it was a long-awaited male heir. We even have the documents from the time which had to be last minute changed to change prince to princess when she was born, because there was such expectation that it would be a boy. It's not. But that is only the first pregnancy. She seems to get pregnant sort of first try. So there is optimism that, okay, well, that was just the dress rehearsal. We'll get on with making the boy next. But that doesn't happen. She also suffers some miscarriages, possibly a stillbirth. There is no male child that comes from that relationship. That's one element of it. The second, again, is geopolitical. It always has to be. And there are shifts in the alliances once again across Europe. Anne is seen, obviously she's English, but she's spent time in the French court. She has alliances, connections to the French court, whereas, of course, Catherine had been Spanish and imperial. England wants to make friends with the Spanish and the Empire again. Anne is an obstacle to that. And the French aren't willing to defend her because she isn't a French princess. She just spent some time there. She was there for a few years on exchange. She doesn't, she isn't French. That change is very important as well. The other element to this is there is a suggestion that there's a lot of emotional tension in their marriage, that the sort of passionate volatility that inspired Henry's desire for her is not working in a marriage. She isn't as obedient as he might want her to be. And because he had to move heaven and earth in order to marry her, there's so much at stake in the marriage working out. There's so much pressure on it, and it just isn't. And so he fairly quickly starts to take mistresses. She does not appear to accept this in the way that her predecessor had, is the suggestion. And she becomes very, very worried about her position, as she has every right to be. And that anxiety, it appears, leads to her saying some things that are then used against her. So there are a number of conversations that get used against her. One appears to be a sort of flirtation with a member of the court, where there's sort of a discussion about whether he's interested in so-and-so and what have you. And she says, essentially, if something less than good were to happen to the king, you might look for dead men's shoes. In other words, if the king would die, maybe you're interested in me, which is not an okay thing to say about the king.
I mean, it's not really an okay thing to say about anyone, to be like, if my husband dies, we can hook up. I mean, it's like, I understand she's being humiliated publicly, so I get why she's feeling a little bit
and there's a whole other element of, she's supposed to flirt with male courtiers. That's sort of part of her role as well. There's this sort of courtly love tradition where she's supposed to be this unattainable goddess that people write poetry to, and that's part of her kind of allure. So that's part of it as well. But she probably shouldn't have said that, and she shouldn't have said it in people's hearing. He immediately gets uncomfortable, as he has every right to do, because it doesn't work out for him either. And so there are these sort of snippets of things where she just flirts a little too hard, essentially. And again, he's sleeping with someone else probably at this time and is actively courting someone else at this time, who appears to be playing the sort of Anne Boleyn card in an intentional way. Whereas, as we've discussed, she possibly was saying no and meaning it. This other person might be doing that, might be doing something else. And so it's an incredibly tense, terrifying time. And yes, she says something vaguely treasonous, which is not a good idea and is used against her. So there's this essentially conspiracy to accuse her of adultery. And we know that it's a conspiracy and that they're trumped up charges, because when you go through the details of the indictments, a lot of those places, she wasn't there that day that they've got on there, or she was extraordinarily pregnant or recovering from a miscarriage. And so probably not having lots and lots of sex. And so it just doesn't line up. And one of the men who she's accused of committing adultery with, of course, if you've read The Other Boleyn Girl, is her brother, which I don't say things definitely did or did not happen very often as a historian unless we have concrete proof. But I'm willing to stand here. Well, okay, I'm sitting down. I'm willing to sit here and tell you right now that Anne Boleyn did not sleep with her brother. You know, the ridiculousness of the charges is part of the game. It's supposed to so completely scandalize that you don't know what to do with it. And even if you don't believe the worst thing that they chuck at her, you're willing to go, well, she almost certainly didn't do that. But maybe she slept with the musician. You know, she might have done that. And he does admit to it. He confesses to it, possibly under torture, but he does admit to it. So, you know, it's that sort of sliding scale that people use so much even today to go, here's a ridiculous thing, in order to get something still scandalous and horrible through.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, that is another parallel with Angelina Jolie, because people often accuse her of having hooked up with her brother.
Okay, I'm learning something now.
Yeah, well, yes, that is part of her lore. And I mean, it hasn't come up for a long time because there've been so many other things that people say about her, but that was something people said. And obviously she has denied that, and so has her brother. They've said that's ridiculous. And her response, I think, on Inside the Actors Studio when she's asked about that was that people have sick minds. But it's interesting that we go back to that playbook of what depraved things can we accuse you of doing. So it's fascinating that some of these ridiculous things we make up about women to slut shame them are the same today. Also,
I had no idea.
Yeah, or like you hooked up with a rock star. I'm thinking about how scandalized Canada was when Margaret Trudeau partied with the Rolling Stones, right? So this still comes up in more modern history and more modern gossip scandals, all of these narratives. So it's a conspiracy. So Henry's working, I'm assuming, with his courtiers to discredit his wife, and it's a PR war.
Yeah, it's largely Thomas Cromwell who's putting all of this together. He's interviewing witnesses. He's interviewing Anne's women. They have an important role in this, which is, of course, very terrifying to Anne. These are women she trusts, she essentially lives with. They help dress her. They help look after her. And in many cases, they're betraying her in a life and death scenario, really. And a lot of these men, of course, are close with her. We've said her brother, of course, the musician in question, Mark Smeaton, who I've never heard compared to Mick Jagger. But cool, you know, is someone who was in her chambers, and she probably again did flirt with. So this sort of invasion is terrifying, and it should be. It ends up being fatal.
How did we get to the point where she's executed? Because as you pointed out earlier, Catherine of Aragon wasn't. She was just sort of sent away.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. You know, Catherine is too important to execute. That's a huge part of it. As we said, she is the people's princess. She's hugely popular within England, but she's also part of the Spanish royal family. Her nephew is the Holy Roman Emperor. You risk a war. I mean, that he risked a war in divorcing her. He'd certainly risk a war and having her executed. And you're never going to manage to accuse Catherine of Aragon of adultery. It's just not going to happen. No one's going to believe that. With Anne, we've spoken about the Boleyns. They're not that important. The Howards are willing to throw her to the wolves. It's her uncle who, you know, presides over a lot of this. People are willing to believe horrible, depraved things of her. And it's a very convenient way to get rid of her. There's no concern then about her becoming a problem later on. Catherine at this point as well has died of natural causes, almost certainly, although some people suggest at the time that she's poisoned. And so by doing away with Anne, he's got a blank slate, right? He doesn't have to worry about being accused of being a bigamist, that there's any question of illegitimacy over any children that he has with a next wife. He's a widower, bless him, right? And so he can just leave all of that behind and start fresh. It makes sense in a sort of twisted, horrible way to have her executed. What's really very, I think, tragic, I mean, there's so many things tragic, but an extra sort of twist of the knife about all of this is that shortly before she's executed, the marriage is annulled. So there is no marriage. And so Elizabeth is made illegitimate as well. She may agree to this in the hopes of protecting her daughter. That they may have even suggested that she'd live if she agreed to this. That, of course, does not end up being the case. And so just to be absolutely sure, they annul the marriage as well.
They're going overboard. And it's interesting because obviously nothing quite like this would happen today. But as we've said earlier, there are similar things. You can still divorce someone and destroy their reputation, which people often do. I'm thinking about lots of celebrities where, I mean, Brad Pitt's PR team clearly decided to go to war with Angelina Jolie. There are all these press reports that she's crazy, but no one will specify what she's done, even though we know there's an FBI file on him, right? So this sort of death of reputation still happens, even if you're not beheading someone. But I do want to talk about the beheading because this is, I mean, it's extraordinary. So it happens. How do the people in the court respond? And how does the British public respond to their queen being decapitated?
It's shocking. They go overboard. It is overkill because not only is this the killing of a queen consort, which had never been done in these explicit terms. You know, there are cases where, I don't think in England, possibly, but certainly in other courts in Europe where they just sort of imprison her for a while. And then eventually, oh, she's dead. And ooh, what happened? Not quite sure. This is a queen consort being killed, being executed on orders of the king, essentially. But more than that, I mean, when she was crowned with the crown that's usually reserved for the monarch himself. So she's an anointed queen. She's crowned with this sovereign's crown for the monarch. And all of this, the sort of the entire mechanism of government and law had gone into making her the legitimate queen of England. And then she's executed. So it's incredibly scandalous. If I had to try to take the pulse, and again, it's very difficult to do, I think most people would be confused and a little scared, you know, regardless of how they felt about her. This has crossed a line. Certainly, there are certain ambassadors, other people in the court and country who are a little bit gleeful about this. You know, she had it coming a bit. But for the most part, it's just kind of scary.
Well, it's just, as we said before, it's domestic violence on a national scale. It's using your resources as a monarch to kill your wife. I mean, it is terrifying. And I just am beyond terrifying, really. But
well, it's worth remembering she's not the only one who dies. Of course, all the men who are accused of adultery with her, including her brother, are executed as well. So it is a bloodbath.
Yeah. So, I mean, it kind of almost reminds you of the Red Scare and McCarthyism that happened, right? Where you're getting people whose reputations are ruined, whose lives are ruined, mostly because of rumor and because of political agenda that some nefarious people had. And so Thomas Cromwell kind of reminds me of McCarthy in that way because he's trying to consolidate power by just ruining everyone else's life. But you see that these things keep happening throughout history. Like, we really don't learn from history, or maybe we learn the wrong lessons from history.
Well, I think one lesson here is that we can look at Cromwell or at Cranmer or at any of the people involved in this. But of course, you know, Cromwell doesn't last that much longer after. He's dead in 1540. You know, Cranmer manages to sneak through. He's killed by another monarch later on. But the problem here is Henry, right? And I think for a very, very long time, we've been pointing to lots of people around Henry as whispering things in his ear or pushing him to do things. And even Wolf Hall, which is, I think, the most recent big iteration of this, has scenes where Anne is pushing him to do things. But he's the issue here. He's the common denominator, right? And so really this is a story about tyranny. And it's a story about those who get in line with it and those who don't. But the problem is the tyrant, right?
Yeah. And he definitely, I mean, at least the way I see him, he's kind of always playing the victim. It's very much like Penn Badgley on You, that character, where it's like, I have to kill all these women. It's not something I want to do. Why does the world keep conspiring against me so that I have to kill all these women? Because if you know about Tudor history, you know that Anne Boleyn's not the only wife he kills. He kills another wife.
Yeah.
So
her cousin.
Absolutely. That poor family. Well, I mean, also do learn your lesson and protect your daughters better. Like, just send that daughter to another country, send her to France and keep her there. Don't let her meet Henry. Anyway, it's just fascinating to me that sequel happens really with Catherine Howard. Okay, so is there anything else about the response that we should discuss? Anything else? I mean, how long was this a big news story? Or was it because Henry was just so scandalous, was constantly marrying new people, that did people just forget about this quickly?
That's a good question. No, they don't forget about it, partly because of Elizabeth. Her continued relevance means that this is something that's always being discussed, always being thought about. And I think with Henry, the compounding of scandal does not, in fact, make those initial scandals go away. I think that the 16th century has a slightly better attention span than we do in the 21st. But I think it's really because of Elizabeth that it has to keep being discussed, because the question of her legitimacy, her lineage, just keeps coming up.
Yeah. So the is she legitimate question, I guess, keeps this in the news. And as you said, the news cycle didn't move on as rapidly. I mean, they had the printing press, but they didn't have smartphones. So,
exactly.
It takes a while for that pamphlet to circulate to everyone in the country. So
it's not TikTok. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Okay, so the last segment that we're going to do is called Hindsight is 2026. And this is where we choose the one moment, although you might pick several, that we might have handled differently if we were the subject of today's story. So basically, you could think of this is about Anne Boleyn. So if you were Anne Boleyn, would you do something differently? Is there one moment that you would have handled differently?
As we've discussed, this is such a story about systems of patriarchy.
Exactly.
That it's very, very difficult, I think, to suggest a moment that, you would have changed or done differently. And I think sometimes picking up something like that ends up feeling a little bit like victim blaming, right? Because you're going, oh, well, if she'd just done that, that would have been the smart thing to do. And in some ways, she did everything right, bless her, right? She said no. She said no for years. There wasn't really an option to say no once it was marriage. You don't do that. None of his other wives, some of whom might have liked to have said no. Catherine Parr, I'm thinking of in particular here, had that option. You just have to go with it. And, I think the system was so set up against her that there was very little, I think, she could have done. There's a great, I don't know if you've read Maggie O'Farrell, who of course wrote Hamlet, which is very popular at the moment because of the film. She wrote a book called The Marriage Portrait, which has nothing to do with Anne Boleyn, but similar sort of historical period. And another wife who history suggests was killed by her husband. And it gives this sort of other, I mean, I'm giving it away. I'm so sorry. But there is an alternative ending that happens. And she gets away, she escapes essentially. And I mean, that would be lovely if she just ran, right? She just got on a horse and went at some point. But I think that's where you get the real psychological thriller of all of this, that feeling of being trapped when you're not actually imprisoned, that she can feel the walls closing in on her, but it's not that she can, conceivably she could just get on a horse, but that isn't sort of available to her as an option. So I don't think she had many opportunities to do other than she did.
I know far less than you about this period, but I would agree. It doesn't seem like she had a lot of agency. My one critique, I guess, is not of Anne. I mean, obviously, Henry did everything wrong. But Anne's family, I really can't believe that they didn't learn from their mistakes and that her cousin, Catherine Howard, still married him. When it seems to me from the historical narrative, she really didn't want to and was also so young. And it was clear that she was going to make mistakes and that she was going to end up being executed.
Yeah, Catherine is I mean, we can have a whole other conversation about Catherine Howard. She's an incredibly tragic case, probably a victim of sexual abuse as a child, is how we would now think of her, and completely manipulated by the men around her, seemingly sort of even blackmailed by some of the men in her life, and ultimately, yes, sort of set up to fail, and much more than Anne, positioned in front of the king, I think, in order to direct policy and, again, these larger questions in a particular direction. She was sacrificed in a much more obvious way than Anne was. So yeah, I mean, they should have learned from it, but I think at the end of the day, they may have known just as well that it might go bad, but just didn't care.
I mean, I guess they figure if they can navigate it slightly better than the Boleyns did, they will get a lot of grace and favor residences and titles and things in the interim. I don't know if that was the calculus. I have no idea.
I don't know. It's always hard to sort of read these things. They don't exactly keep diaries about, this is my plan. But, I think she was positioned for a particular purpose at a particular time. This is at the ends of the marriage to Anne of Cleves, who we could also talk about, in an attempt to direct Henry in a particularly more sort of conservative direction and give a boost to the Howards, who had been kind of floundering for a time. I mean, whether they thought there was a chance she could be successful, it's hard to say. Certainly she was successful in catching his eye. They married very quickly, all of that. He was completely enamored with her by all the evidence. But she had these skeletons in her closet, we might think of them. It's in fact a past of sexual abuse. And, that comes up. And that's really the issue. How much they knew about that at the time, or how much they cared that could become an issue is hard to say.
Okay, well, thank you so much for all of that detail. I mean, I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot. I've learned a lot. Where can our listeners find you? Where can they find your books? I'm sure everyone's going to want to check them out. I mean, you've written so much about Thomas More, who was a fascinating character.
Oh, thank you. So I have a website. It's just joannepaul.com. You can find all sorts of things on there. I have an events page. I am on Instagram, Dr. Joanne Paul. I have a sort of legacy account on X. And every once in a while, I'll repost something on there. I'm on Blue Sky. So you can find me around. In terms of the book, House of Dudley and Thomas More were published both in the UK and in North America. So you can find them ideally at your local independent bookstores, but also at all major book stores and websites.
Well, thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for joining us. As I said, this is my Roman Empire, so it was just a delight to talk to you about this. And just to explain to our listeners what happened with this really sordid story that is, I don't know. I don't know if I've ever heard a more scandalous story. It's pretty scandalous.
That's why they keep making TV shows about it.
Exactly. So if you would like to listen to more of The Reheat, you can listen for free on the Seeker app. You can also find the show on the Frequency Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to hear more from me, you can find me on Instagram at Sahagin Sarah. And if you liked this podcast, one thing you can really do that is going to help us is to please rate, review, and subscribe, because that helps other listeners find us too. If you would like us to keep growing, another thing that you can do is to support us on Patreon at patreon.com/thereheat. That really helps us with just providing the best content possible. We've got some goods in store for you. And above all, thanks for listening.